In this episode, find out how a simple list sparked a revolution. Discover the secret to balancing your marriage, household, and reclaiming your time as a woman.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life.
In this episode, find out how a simple list sparked a revolution. Discover the secret to balancing your marriage, household, and reclaiming your time as a woman.
Welcome to Women Winning Divorce, the podcast helping successful women navigate divorce with dignity so you can protect yourself, your children, and your assets. I'm Heather Quick, founding attorney at Florida Women's Law Group, where women win at life.
This week, we had Rodsky on the show, and we had a great conversation about how to divide household tasks fairly using Eve's Fair Play system. Practical tools to communicate your needs and priorities to your partner effectively, and how fair play has redefined partnership. I hope this episode offers some inspiration to any of our listeners who may be looking at a new year as a chance to make a change, start fresh, and create a better path forward for you and your family. Stay tuned for the full episode. Welcome to this week's episode of Women Winning Divorce. I'm Heather Quick, owner and attorney at Florida Women's Law Group. Today, Eve Rodsky is joining us. Eve is the author of Fair Play, a game-changing solution for when you have too much to do and more life to live. And find your unicorn space. Reclaim your creative life in a too busy world. She has used her Harvard-trained background in organizational management to ask the simple yet profound question, what would happen if we treated our homes as our most important organizations? Today, Eve and I will be discussing how to divide household tasks fairly using Eve's Fair Play system, practical tools to communicate your needs and priorities to your partner effectively, and how fair play has redefined partnership. Welcome to the show, Eve.
Oh, I love that introduction. We have a lot to tackle. Thanks, Heather. It's good to be here.
We do. Well, thank you. I'm so excited to have you. I love your book, and I could just go on and on, which we will do here today. But before we get into it, for our listeners, I would love it if you would just share a little bit about yourself. I mean, there's so much to share, but just start with where you are now and kind of how you got there maybe a little bit with the book.
Absolutely. Well, I guess the first thing I'll say is that I define myself now as an expert on the gendered division of labor, Heather. And I think it's important for your listeners to know that that was not on my third grade, what do you want to be when you grow up board? And it definitely wasn't what I said I was going to use with my law degree. I remember being in law school, and Elizabeth Warren was actually our orientation teacher before she was a senator. And she asked us, what do we want to do with our law degree? And this was 1999. And this was the time of, the turn of the century where we were told all of the feminist work had been done before us. And we had to pave the way for being in a workplace that was equally beneficial to women as it was to men. And so I literally said, and this is sort of funny, but it was true. I thought that I would be a United States Senator from New York. I wanted to be president of the United States, possibly, and also a Nick City dancer. And then maybe all at the same time, right? Because also the Legally Blonde era, like it's hard. So
exactly.
This idea of smashing all of these glass ceilings felt very attainable to me. But the reason why Fair Play became, I'd say, a movement was it started with my own life story, because the only thing I could tell you, realistically, Heather, that I was smashing, like peas for my toddler, Zach, while breastfeeding a baby Ben, basically desperately trying to hold on to a job where they told me that if I wanted to breastfeed, it would be in a broom closet and I'd have to bring my own battery pack since there were no outlets in there. And on top of it, I lost all my direct reports when I was on maternity leave. So I think that realization that I was being abandoned by my workplace that I really, really loved, on top of the fact that my partner was abandoning me in the home. I talked very much about a text that Seth sent me that said, I'm surprised you didn't get blueberries. And how that text put me crying on the side of the road because I was negotiating a return to work. And not only was I abandoned in my workplace, but my husband now saw me as the fulfiller of his smoothie needs. That was a point in my life where if I look back now, I wish I had known that women shoulder 2/3 or more of what it takes to run a home and family, regardless of whether they work outside the home. And actually it gets worse the more money women make. I wish I had known that, Heather. And so if I had a podcast like yours, or if there was even podcasts back in 2011, there was nothing really. There was just What to Expect When You're Expecting, which was
the worst book ever. I hated that
ever.
book. I didn't get very far, and I was like, I'm not reading that anymore.
My child's a jelly bean. How does that help me? No, what I should have known is that my husband was going to be a fucking asshole, you know? That would have helped me a lot more than the child being a jelly bean. So I was expecting an equal partner. He had been my husband Seth had been an equal partner to me before kids. And it was a big shock once they came. And so that's really what I've devoted my life to, Heather, is making sure that I'm the ghost of Christmas future and no woman behind me has to go through that again.
Well, I love that so much. I want to join you in that because I'm seeing it. I had a similar experience to you, but then I see it now on the back end. And the women are going through a divorce. You know, they can't go back and they don't want to hear what they should. They're telling me what they should have done. I've got 2 daughters and a son, and my daughters in their young 20s. And then I'm around many of them and I'm like, no, what are you girls thinking? You're in college. You have something to offer. Keep doing that. Don't just tell me you can't wait to get married and not work. We have a lot of work to do. It is still happening. We got a lot of work to do because they don't understand. They don't understand.
Well, I don't think people realize, right? And this is why I love your podcast. Women don't realize that they take a financial risk when they get married. I think everybody thinks that it's the opposite, that they get a financial boon when they get married. This idea that, well, I want to marry a breadwinner, or men who would say to me, I make my wife's life. No, that's not true. What you're signing up for, if you decide to look at it the way you just said that some of the young women in your life are looking at it, is really backwards. Basically, what they're saying is, I'm willing to give up all of my earning potential to support your earning potential and thus give up all my power. This is not just a message of, oh, women have to stay in the workforce. That's not what we're talking about. What fair play is about is saying, regardless of where you are, what life choices you make, the unpaid labor that you're going to be doing is valuable in a way that it hasn't been valuable to the court systems that Heather fights for you every single day for, that it is not inherently valuable in any of those systems. And it's definitely not inherently valuable in your community systems. Just ask your schools or your health systems that say breastfeeding is free when it's really an 1,800 hour a year job. What happens in all of these systems, including the family law system, and as you know, and including our communities, is that women's time, Heather, and you know this more than I do, based on the type of child support and alimony women are given, women's time in all these systems has always been seen as infinite, like sand, and pretty worthless. Whereas we guard men's time as if it's finite, like diamonds. Just look at the literature that says breastfeeding is free. Look at what happened when women enter male professions. Salaries automatically go down. But the reason why I bring that up is because you think you're going into these really fun, amazing arrangements you may see on TikTok or that look perfect online. You're making maybe the perfect banana bread or whatever trad wife weird thing you're seeing. And the reality becomes, when you give up your power, it becomes very painful. And so then over time, what happens is that women start to become complicit in their own oppression. And we start to say things to ourselves. Even I did, who married someone that promised me he'd be an equal partner, and I was making more money than him at the time. We start to say things like, oh, I'm wired differently to hear the babies cry. My job is more flexible. In the time it would take me to tell Seth what to do, I should do it myself. Yes, we're both colorectal surgeons, but my partner's better at focusing on one task at a time, and I can find the time. So we start to rationalize why we do all of this unpaid labor, to the point where, unfortunately, it leads to such resentment that we now know that it's over 80% of women are the ones initiating divorce.
And I think, that when you talked about the value of time in your book,
Yes.
it really hit me. I was like, aha, that is true. And most of us grew up with that pattern, right? Like with what
Yeah.
we saw. That was like my grandmother, my mother divorced young and still worked, but when she remarried,
Same.
and then she remarried,
same. My
for
mother,
money.
single mother,
And,
but
then she
same
gave
stuff.
all that up, but still doing it all. And like, it just hit home. And I thought this message really needs to be driven to women, because
Right.
we need to recognize that our time is valuable. And when you get into this arrangement and and that's what I want you to share about the list. Like, it's
Yes,
just,
let's talk about it. Yes.
oh my gosh, because it's so true. And then I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. There's that. There's all these things.
So let's talk about what my life looked like after I realized I wasn't smashing any glass ceilings, Heather, and my husband was treating me as the fulfiller of his smoothie needs, my blueberries breakdown time in my life. I think what happened to me at that point was I had two choices. I could become a gray version of myself and stay in a marriage that wasn't working for me, or I could do what a lot of women were doing, the three words that you work on, a court order and custody, which were three magic words. But I decided on sort of a third path, which was just to become curious about what was happening to me.
Okay.
And so, as my son says, the biggest Google search for me is Eve Rodsky still married? And the spoiler alert is, yes, I'm still married to Seth. But at the time, what was interesting was it turns out that the first and most important thing, because I didn't have you, like a Heather, which now I'll be listening to you forever and would love to collaborate more. But I didn't have access to podcasts. I didn't have access, as we said, to any there was no social media in 2011 in a meaningful way. So what had to happen to me was I had to see that it was happening to other women. So I'll tell you just a quick story that I write about in Fair Play. So I go on this breast cancer march with 9 other women who are very powerful. Not all of them are married to men, but we had like a stroke and trauma doctor with us. We had like a award-winning producer, downtown LA. This was in 2011. And we were all in pink, glitter or whatever, holding signs for a friend that had been recently diagnosed. And what was interesting about this Saturday morning, because not all of us were married to men, but most of us were. If I hadn't had that blueberries moment and the difficulty with my job, I'm not sure I would have recognized that all the other women besides me, Heather, were looking at their phone at noon, like the reverse of Cinderella, like we were all turning into like small pumpkins. And I started to look over their shoulders. And what I saw was that they were responding to men. Their husbands were saying things to them like, when are you coming home from the parade? I write about, one of my friend's husbands who wrote, what's the address of the birthday party? My other friend's husband said, where is Hudson's soccer bag? My favorite was my friend Kate's husband. I still keep his text framed basically on the bulletin board. And his text was, do the kids need to eat lunch? Right. And so what happened to me that day was my first act of resistance. And that act of resistance was to say to these women, and it was so painful, Heather, because they all looked at me and said, Eve, I appreciate that you made this dim sum reservation for after the march, but we left our husbands, we left our partners with too much to do. And so these beautiful, strong women went back to go find Hudson's soccer bag, bring a perfectly wrapped gift to a birthday party and to feed their kids lunch. And so before they left, I said, you know what, I'll let you leave, but I want to count out what has been going on. So we basically had 30 phone calls and 46 texts for 10 women over 30 minutes.
Wow.
That problem has a name. When I put my researcher hat on, it turns out that is called the second shift. It's called emotional labor. It's called the mental load. But my favorite term of all was the term invisible work, because it's work and it's invisible. And a woman named Arlene Kaplan Daniels coined that term in 1986, saying the work of women in the home has to be invisible because America doesn't have any social safety nets like universal health care or childcare. So we have to convince women that they're better at wiping asses and doing dishes, and to say my standards are too high for anybody else to help, because we have to condition women to do this unpaid labor as our safety net. Once I read that, I started to cry, Heather, because I had been so gaslit to believe that as well. And so I went on a quest for an entire year to make the invisible visible. I started to ask women in Facebook groups, because again, this is 2011, 2012 now, where there was no social media. I didn't have the podcast. So I call up my friend who knew a woman like Heather. Hey, Heather, what are the women in your life doing that takes more than 2 minutes of unpaid labor, invisible work that's invisible to their partner? And I started to get women all over the country that weighed in. It was the first time, Heather, in my life with 2 young kids, I didn't feel alone, where I had people I didn't know come and say to me, hey, I got your spreadsheet from the Jewish Federation of Arizona. I started to put together more and more invisible work. And then it grew to 10 tabs, then 20, then 50. Finally, it became a 98 tab spreadsheet in Excel that I titled the Should I Do spreadsheet. And it was so painful because up until that point, the only advice I had heard was make a list. If you make a list, things will get better. I sent the spreadsheet to Seth with no context. Can't wait to discuss.
Right.
And I didn't even get a response from him. I got a see no evil monkey emoji, like the early pixelated version of one of those monkey emojis. And that was the beginning of my journey to say lists alone don't work, but systems do. I'm a lawyer like you. I work in systems. I work in organizational systems for family foundations and family businesses. And it was my goal in life was to start to use systems to rectify the fact that the best list in the world that's ever been made on all the unpaid labor of women had not worked and had failed me.
So you turned the list of the shit you do into called fair play.
Yes.
But you also did get your husband on board. And let's talk about that, because that's a big part of it. Like, okay, because you said looking at it alone, saying this is the list, doesn't make you feel better.
No.
Kind of almost worse, because now you're
Worse.
like, oh my gosh.
And by the way, that
overwhelming.
We have our first study of fair play. I'm like, ta-da, announcing it because we just got our results back. Fair play, when you do it, makes life better and increases marital happiness, satisfaction, less depression. However, when you learn about fair play, if you just learned about it and don't do anything about it, it does make things worse.
Right. Yes.
Because ignorance is bliss. So this is a 101. Let's just say that to people. It's okay for you to feel triggered. It's okay for you to feel angry. That's an appropriate emotion for this 101 conversation. I just want people to understand that.
And I think that is so important that you say that, because you hear it. And then at least, if you're listening to the book or read the book, right? They're like, I don't know if that conversation is going to go that way in my situation. And they may be even too afraid to begin to.
Yeah.
Which we both recognize and understand that not everyone feels enough power to even begin the conversation. But for our audience, I would love for them to hear, right? So you came up with this and how that began to be able to be communicated to your husband.
And my mom, who's a professor of social work, always gets mad at me and says, why do you make your content for women and not for men? But typically the person who's gaslit into an unfair arrangement really has to be the one to start to set their own game changing life, right? And to take that agency. And so I always think it's very important to educate and talk to women, especially I was my first client. Like they talk about that hair club for men. There was an old ad. I'm not just a hair club for men president. I'm the first client. I was the first client of Fair Play. And what the first question I asked that I think was transformative for me, because I'm not a therapist and I didn't want to come at this from a therapist perspective, because we had gone to therapy and all I was told was to say I statements and I should think about things from Seth's perspective. And I just felt like something was completely missing. The whole gender lens was missing. And now we train therapists all over the country and actually mediators in the family law system, because I'm so sick of mediators undervaluing unpaid labor. What I realized was that these are very difficult conversations to have. And it's because we weren't really thinking about the home in the beginning as what we should have been thinking of it as. And so my question was, what if we start to think of the home as an organization?
Right.
Because even my Aunt Marion's Mahjong group, Heather, is an organization. They have more clearly defined expectations than the home. You don't bring snack twice to the Mahjong group, you're out.
Right. Yes.
But the home, we're using the 3 most toxic words that will ever be used that will set you up for Heather's services or resentment. And that is, we're going to figure it out. Nobody figures things out. Yeah. And so the opposite of that is explicitly defined expectations. That's what you need for an organization. I realized that I could write down, similar to the way I was doing in my legal practice, for myself. And that's what began Fair Play in the beginning of 2012. So we have over 10 years of data now. It works. Spoiler alert. But the main advice is you have to start where you are, as you said. And there's 3 places where you can start. So the thing I wrote down for myself was successful organizations have 3 things. They have boundaries, they have systems, and they have communication. And so Heather, you were making a communication point. But first, let me talk about so what do you think for me would be the easiest thing to tackle? Communication, boundaries, or systems? Or as a lawyer, what would you like to tackle first?
I think boundaries is a good spot because that's a place where very often we lack as women, right? You have to intentionally set boundaries, particularly in relationships, not as often with our kids. It's easy because sometimes.
Right, don't do that.
At least when they're little.
Yes, exactly. I think without boundaries, everything falls apart. And unfortunately, I didn't know that at first. So for me, I figured just like Aunt Marion's Mahjong group, if I can put together a snack plan for the home, that the system alone would be able to solve things. So we'll talk about what that system is. It's straightforward. It works based on science and organizational management principles. But it's exactly what you said. Women couldn't even conceive of changing the dynamic of who picks up the kids from school, who handles shots, who's planning for birthday parties, who's researching school transitions, who's looking into colleges, who's teaching a child to tie their shoe. They couldn't even fathom not taking in that responsibility because of that painful thing I said earlier, that we've been conditioned since birth to believe our time is not as valuable as our partners. So I think, and even for women would have stress response when I'd say, close your eyes, women married to men, picture your husband running around, taking care of the kids, cleaning up, and you're sitting on the couch, watching television for an hour, for 2 hours, just there. Women would start getting a stress response like that. I can't even picture just sitting around while all that chaos and someone else is doing everything for me. So what happens is that we breach our boundaries. And that was the main conversation I had to have with Seth to really come to the table with the systems and with the communication. The first thing was understanding my own boundaries, doing the work on myself. And the work I did on myself, Heather, was understanding that my partner had 3 hours after our kids went to bed to check Sports Center, work out, finish a PowerPoint deck, go to bed, where I'm moving like a magical elf, like a quiet magical elf around the house for 3 more hours after he went to bed, and doing things in service of our household till my head hit that pillow. And being able to say, I'm not going to live like that anymore.
Right.
That's a painful thing. You have to be willing to really believe you're not going to live like that anymore. And I'm not Rosa Parks, but I love one of her quotes. And she said, when your mind is made up, the fear diminishes. My mind was made up, Heather, that I wasn't going to live like that anymore. And that's the hard part. So many women, right? We end up we have that conversation and someone doesn't meet us halfway. And then we end up, with Heather, we end up saying, I'm not going to stay. And that's okay. That's an appropriate reaction to somebody who's not going to respect your boundaries. But when I said to Seth, I only have 24 hours in a day, you believe your time is more valuable because you make more money than me. And how crazy is that? Because we just both get 24 hours in a day. Right. My time is equal to your time because I don't get more time than you. We have the same amount of time in one day. I deserve equal time choice over how I use my day the way you do. I think the fact that Seth was willing to understand that, Heather, was the breakthrough that we both needed. But he's a great guy. He has the intention to be there. We just can't get over that finish line. Then you can go to systems, and that's easy. Or if you're somebody who says, we've never even had a conversation about this, I could never talk to my partner the way you talk to Seth. Then you start with communication. Correct. So that's how you know where to start. Boundaries is if I'm fucking resentful. I'm out of here if this doesn't change. You can really think and do some work on yourself about what boundary you want to protect. Systems, if you have that partner who maybe, if you're so, overwhelmed, just I'll help. That person, we can go straight to systems to get stuff off your plate. If you've never sat down for a conversation like this, or you did this conversation once 10 years ago and you say it didn't work well, so I can't come back to the table, then we have to tackle communication techniques.
Yeah. And I think it's so important that it's the value of our time, and particularly, in a marriage, a partnership where the wife or the woman is at home. And so it's like, okay, so I think you would agree, investing in our children and the things that I am doing have a lot of value and are important. We agreed we would do this, but now I'm doing it alone. And then that's just not fair. And that's what you talked about, right? It's not necessarily equal, but it's equity.
Equity. Well, that's the big important thing. The big problem, Heather, I think you hear 50-50 custody or 50-50 this or 50-50 parenting, or I have no idea what that means. I have zero idea how you would measure, unless you're doing some crazy scorekeeping exercise about what 50-50 means. And so when you can move from equality to equity, something changes. Basically, what changes is I can give you tools, which is fair play, and say, these tools work because I'm not telling you a prescriptive way to live your life. What I'm saying to you is that the fair play should I do spreadsheet became 100 cards. As you know, it's an actual card deck, but it's also a metaphor for everything that it takes to run a home and family. You play with 60 cards if you don't have children. You add 40 cards when you do have children, which in itself is a big, big, major life change. And what I'm saying to you is that it's okay if you want to be in a household where one person holds 100 cards and the other person holds 0. That's okay, as long as there's explicitly defined expectations that you got there intentionally.
Right.
So I know that that's the least, unfortunately, that family structure from 10 years of research, where a woman takes on all of the unpaid labor and a man does not help at all, the Leave It to Beaver model.
Right.
That structure is the most vulnerable to divorce.
Yes.
We hear a lot of men say things like, my wife just became a housewife. She's not interested anymore. She's not interested in her life. She's boring. I mean, horrible things that are said to women, and women are saying, I have no idea what this person's talking about. They begged me to retire. They told me that I had to give up my career if I wanted to be in this marriage. It's a really, really painful transition out of those types of marriages. I find that the most vulnerable. And it's often because the expectations are so different than the reality. Like you said, you see this people frocking in meadows on TikTok. And as those young girls think, it doesn't end up that way. It ends up just with a lot of resentment and distance. And so I don't love that structure. But if that's a structure where you have taken a career pause or you've decided to stay home, what I still see is the most beneficial is what I call the blackjack. So when men who are the breadwinners hold 21 cards, they could be any 21 in the deck, and we can talk about that. Their relationships with their partner are great. And that person who's also still holding, say, 70 to 80 cards, depending, they still perceive fairness, Heather.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
So the problem with holding 100 cards, which is all of the unpaid labor, is that that's a job that never ends. And there's so much, and we'll talk about sort of what the 3 layers of that work is that are so painful. And we just have a new study coming out, as I just said, that shows how it's affecting women's mental and physical health. But before I even get to that, I want to just say that there are many men who are breadwinners who holds cards, this metaphorical cards. And we see the transformative nature of those men's relationship, and fair play becomes a love letter to men because there is a beautiful TED Talk, Robert Waldinger's TED Talk. I think it's actually the most watched TED Talk of all time. And it's a 75-year study out of Harvard that shows the way you predict whether a man is alive at 85 is not if he smoked, not if he exercised, not if he worked, retired, blah, blah, blah. It's the quality of his relationships at 55. And so what I love about this is if you're thinking, oh, I have to bring up a conversation that's asking my partner to do more, that's not how I'd like for you to look at this. I'd like for you to say, I'm having new conversations about how my partner can live longer and how our family unit can be more efficient. That's typically the two things we hear most about people who live in the fair play system, or at least understand the concepts. My home is more efficient. My partner is healthier. And that is what I'm looking for.
And I think, I just know from my experience, we didn't have the benefit of that either, but necessity, we got to divide and conquer.
Yes.
And with 3 kids more, they outnumber us. Like lunches, my mornings, I was building the business, and my mornings were the hardest thing. Like by the time I got to work at 9, I'm like, that was the hardest part of my day, right? I got to do hair and makeup, load them all in the car and get them there without breaking into a sweat in Florida with and then now go and be, a powerhouse, right? As I'm carrying my son who was just, ginormous at 2 and putting him in his car seat to sleep, giving him the Eggo and all that stuff. But what we learned as we had to divide the tasks, what my children saw is what I'm very thankful for is they know their dad can cook, their dad can make their lunches, their dad can take them to the doctor. And my son, all of them, because I think for girls and boys, so important to understand he can do it all too, right? And if I need this washed for tomorrow and dad is right there and I don't need to wait till she gets home and he can do it.
By the way, I don't know you, Heather, but I would predict that is, if you said to me, I'm not in a marriage, I would have said, yes, I think court ordered custody would have been why you look so gorgeous. Or you have a partner that supports you, not just in words, but in actions. And I think it's so much why the Love Languages book has been around for so long, because people understand that acts of service is a love language, but it's more than that. It's a foundational experience to an organization. And I'll give you an example of, I was going to say it literally what your partner is doing for you. I'll just say it again, is it's a foundational to your home organization.
Yes. Also, and then one thing, because I know we talked about and there's so much in the book, but I think we see it a lot where we don't want to give it up, or we do give it up, but then we criticize, which in your book, you can't do that.
You can't do that. No.
And so it was funny because some days, if he had an early meeting, say, all right, I'll cover lunches today. But then they get home at dinner time. My girl's like, who made my lunch today? And I look at him, don't tell him it was me. Because I'm slapping peanut butter and jelly in there and some chips. And he's making homemade salads and a thing. It's ridiculous. But he was way better at that than me. And isn't that great, right? I don't have to kill myself to be the best at everything for our kids. I think we put so much pressure sometimes in the household that's a big myth. And we have this belief what is Susie going to say if I'm not the one in the car line dropping the kids off? Or we build this up that it's bad for us, harder for us.
It's so much harder. And actually, even if you have a partner in the home that it's helpful and more than helpful, that's an actual partner, like your partner or what Seth became. Right. For me, the systems outside are pulling you in other directions, right? The schools will still call you, Heather, even though you're in a big meeting or you're filming a podcast. And you're like, what the hell? My partner is one person on the list. Why are the schools still only including me? Why are all the birthday invitations just coming to me? Why does Paperless Post only have one place for one email address per family? Most of the systems around us are set up for women to handle that unpaid labor. And then, as we know, the family law system, if you're in it, is absolutely set up to devalue and to assume that women were doing that labor and to and to say things to you as one mediator. I was thinking about you today, Heather, because I was remembering for a friend who's doing some research on divorce, a mediator who said to one of my interviewees, I've interviewed, probably, I don't know, now we're in the thousands and thousands of interviews in 17 countries. We have been translated in 33 territories. But one mediator said to a woman, what are you asking for alimony for now? Your partner lets you eat bonbons for 20 years. The unpaid labor of the home, it's a 24-hour job. It's valuable. The fair play cards make it visible. But I want to say something about why it's so invisible, because I think that gets to the system. Mm-hmm. So we talked a lot about boundaries, right? This idea that your time is diamonds. This is a 101 conversation. There's no woman out there that can believe their time is diamonds just by listening to us, except for us to tell you that if you're feeling resentful, it's because people are treating your time as infinite, and we're here for you. We see you. We'll keep working with you on it. Our communities are here for you. But I want to talk a little bit about the system and what it taught me, because those boundary systems, communication is important. We talked about communication and how hard that could be, but we haven't gotten to the system yet. And I want to explain why it's so hard to back out of these things, like you said. And it's not just about standards. The solution is not women lowering their standards or anybody lowering their standards. That's not really the solution. I like to say it's a minimum standard of care, similar to how we have in the law. Right. The reasonable person. Does a reasonable person spill 2,000 degree hot coffee on your lap, or is that reasonable? Right. We're using this idea of what's reasonable everywhere else. We can use it in the home. So the way the system works and why it was so hard for women to get back out of this, including myself, was that I couldn't get accurate data, Heather. Because women were saying to me, I'm not sure why I feel so tired, because my partner is really helpful. Okay. And I'd ask them in the should I do list, okay, well, who's responsible for taking the kids to school? And I hear, well, we both are. Who's responsible for, their birthday parties? Well, we both do things. Okay. So I couldn't get accurate data because of what I call the both trap. Everybody was doing everything and nothing was clear. So I finally asked a question that unlocked the data I needed. And the question was, how does mustard get in your refrigerator? Once I asked that question, Heather, as a sociologist, I'm a lawyer by trade, but that's an anthropological, sociological question. It changed my life, because not only can you change the condiment per country, but spoiler alert, another one, whether it was Norway or mainland China or Florida or California, it was the same. Women married to men, it turns out, were the ones noticing that their son, Johnny, liked yellow mustard with his protein. Otherwise, he would choke on it. So that I would call that conception. In project management, that's sort of the behind the scenes noticing. I wrote that down. Then all of a sudden, women would say to me, oh, and I'm in charge of stakeholder buy-in for what my family wants on the grocery list. They didn't really call it stakeholder buy-in, but I was listening for that. And they said, and I'm also the one who monitors the mustard when it runs low. And I was like, oh my God, I know that phase from organizational management. That's planning. Mm-hmm. And then the reason why they were saying they were both involved was because their partner was going to the store to pick up the mustard. And then, he's bringing home spicy Dijon every fucking time. And I asked for yellow. And how many, are you blind? Do you not see what our child eats every night? Right. So then all of a sudden, the communication becomes feedback in the moment, nails on the chalkboard, attacks. And what we've lost in that interaction was women saying to me things like, well, you want me to trust my husband with my living will, Heather, Eve? He can't even bring home the right type of mustard, right? So the accountability and trust is what's missing. The presenting problem is not the real problem. It's not about the mustard. It's these organizations have started to lose accountability and trust when you don't have a minimum standard of care. When Heather so I like your peanut butter sandwich, but if someone puts in a knife in a car seat, which I had that happen twice, 2 chefs had knives in their child's car seat when they were transporting them, pairing knives in a car seat. You're not going to trust that person to continue to transport your kid to school. And you'll say, well, I should just do it myself. When you continue to layer that on and on and on, if Heather was the mother who, or the partner who just put a lollipop in the bag or zero lunch at all, then you lose that accountability and trust.
Right.
So that's why the system is predicated on coming together on some sort of minimum standard of care for whatever you're talking about, all of the fair play cards. There's some investment in the communication around it. And then saying, you know what? You're going to CPE the whole task, which means in shorthand, you own the conception, the planning, and the execution. And that's why it's equity and not equality. I don't need 50 cards. Women started to tell me that they perceive fairness when their partner took on one card with ownership. One. So that is everything wrapped up in a nutshell. That is the boundary systems communication formula. It really starts with this idea around accountability and trust based on ownership. It is something beautiful to invest in, like exercise. It doesn't happen overnight, but it is life-changing.
And it's so, I really think for our listeners, it's just however you're going to start, right? With boundaries or systems or communication, but absent, when you have other issues, more serious, violence, substance abuse, mental health. But when those aren't there, sometimes it's like, give them a chance to say no. Yeah. Like try to present that conversation in a way that sets you up for success, not in the middle of dinner at 6:00 and everybody's tired and the kids are screaming. Like, when you can really give them a chance because you invested in the relationship. And, I'm just assuming with the children, because I think so many of the divorces I see, it's just that they're done, right? They take on too much and they weren't able to have that partnership that they had maybe before kids, or again, it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And, that investment that you've already really made, and absent like the three things I said, I've been in this for a long time. I've been married the whole time, thankfully, but my parents, so I've seen, I got a real front row seat at multiple marriages, same stuff, people like trading it in for something else. Like that's what men do all the time. It's like the same thing. Like you're just repeating and repeating. So if it was worth the initial investment, and it still is, at least beginning to understand this, and not in a blaming way, like what do I do, right? I mean, which it's true, but like, setting it up to where they're give them an opportunity to really understand.
Absolutely. And I will say that there is such beauty in, as you said, having those emotion is low, cognition is high type conversations. Typically, ironically, fair play, the introduction of these conversations work really well on birthdays, anniversaries, Valentine's Day, times when you wouldn't want to necessarily have conversation of what you think of as household chores. But it's really about our humanity and understanding that, as we said earlier, this is not about who's picking up the right type of mustard. This is about whether or not we really value each other's time and we want to come to our organization as partners, or do I want to help her? And I really would love you as a partner. But I think what's really sad to me, and I think it's a good place to end on, is communication and why it's a practice. It's not a one-off. So many people will say to me, I had that conversation, Eve, in 2005 and it didn't work. Sort of like going to the doctor and saying, I exercised once in 2005 and so my heart will be healthy now in 2024. Communication is as much of a practice as exercise. And I think people don't look at it that way. They think that people are mind readers, or that they should know things about themselves. That's the figure it out mentality that I'm so against. But there was this one story I want to tell you that I think is a good segue to saying this is a good wrap up, because even if you could just end with this, understanding what communication is. There was a woman that posted in a 27,000 member Facebook group during COVID. And, Heather, people send me stuff now because they're like, oh, you should see this. You should see this. There was a Facebook group out of the UK called The Reasons I Hate My Husband and Kids During COVID. And there were 27,000 members in this group. It was a closed group. I got in, I asked for admission. I got in and I DM'd this woman because I noticed her post. And her post was, if my husband dies during COVID, it'll be because of me, not the disease. So I thought that was a funny post. And so I reached out to her on DM or whatever, Facebook, and said, hey, I'm a researcher. I'd love to learn more about how you communicate with your partner about domestic life. So she was very kind and she reaches back and she says, oh, we don't talk about it. This is my safe space. So I think reflecting on the fact that publicly threatening to murder her partner in front of 27,000 strangers felt safer to her than bringing up this topic with her partner.
Yeah.
And so what I'm saying is that we're already communicating. So I'm not asking for a start. I'm asking for a shift, a shift to collaboration, to efficiency, to generosity, away from these siloed threats that unfortunately lead us to Heather's phone or email.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I appreciate that so much. And that, right, it's just a shift because you are communicating something.
Yes.
It's just maybe not the most productive and not really what you want. It's not going to get you the results you want.
Correct.
But, we just breezed through this. This was so great. I loved this conversation. I want us to be able to certainly talk and collaborate again.
Please.
What's next for you?
Well, that's why I was so happy to be with you. I think for those who are listening here who are going through a divorce, that's why I want to talk to Heather more. We've really been starting to work and advocate for changes in the family law system around how unpaid labor is valued. Mm-hmm. And what we're seeing, something that's troubling to me, is that when there's support calculations or when people are asking for alimony, things like how long it would take to regain a career aren't always taken into account realistically. There's a lot of things that are left out of divorce agreements. Like we often see maybe tuition or college is thought about, but people are not thinking about camps. They're not thinking about the 12-week breaks during winter breaks. Are we willing to pay for enrichment for our kids during that? They're not willing to think about after school activities. Is that something they value? Is that something they want to continue to both contribute to? They're not thinking about spirituality. Do you want to pay for a membership in a church? Do you want your child to get bar mitzvahed? And so what ends up happening is that there's all these gaps in the financial calculations for divorce agreements that then end up affecting women's mental health because there's so much things that they say, unfortunately, took them by surprise. And so I'm really, really interested in making it better for women who want to exit those relationships.
Well, that's awesome. I think we can do it. We can make some progress. I know. And Eve, before we go, can you impart on our listeners what you've learned about women and their resilience throughout your career and experience?
Oh my God. I love women so much. What I'm going to say about resilience, women and the resilience, I think is really important. So important that I wrote a whole second book about it. What I found about resilience was that the key to resilience is being consistently interested in your own life. I wish the key to resilience was a little bit easier. I could tell you it was just exercising 10 minutes a day. It's really not. The key to resilience is being consistently interested in your own life. So much of family life is giving up that interest in our lives to be parents and or partners and or professionals. So what I want to say to women is to be resilient, take that fucking chain off your neck that says your kid's name on it. Put your own initial on your neck. Go to like the local mall, get a costume jewelry, put your initial on your neck and start thinking about metaphorically and physically how you can show up for yourself outside of those three P's.
Love that. I love that. And it's true. And it's going to make a difference. So
I'll ask you that to end. Heather, are you interested in your life?
Oh, I am. Yes.
Yeah, I can tell.
Yeah.
Yes, I can tell.
It took some time, and then I was so fascinated about how fun and exciting and, intellectually challenging, like all the things that I was doing. that were different, that apart from being a wife and a mother.
Yeah. And
But it added to
Yes.
when I did that. Absolutely. When it adds to those relationships
and
as
you think
well.
Your family's proud of you for what you're doing?
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, they are.
That's not the real question. The real question is, are you proud of yourself? But I think that it's also really important to feel that pride in yourself when you see people around you taking pride in you. And often that starts with making other people uncomfortable. So I want everyone to know that even though your family has pride in you, not Heather's, but one's family can have pride in them about what they're doing, it doesn't mean when you start that those people don't feel uncomfortable about what you do. Nobody said, yay, I'm so happy my mom is going on a book tour and not seeing me for 7 weeks. It doesn't work that way. We have to be uncomfortable with other people's discomfort, consistently interested in our own lives. And that's a big piece of the work that we're doing here at the Fair Play Policy Institute.
That is great. Now, lastly, Eve, where can our listeners find you for more information and resources?
Well, yay, we have a new website that just launched today. So we have the Fair Play Policy Institute website. It has a lot of free resources for everybody or anybody who's interested in this type of work or these types of conversations. This is 101. There's a 201 conversation. There's 301. There's 401 conversations there. There's conversations about military spouses, whether your partner travels a lot, what happens in big changes where you're going to give up your career for your partner's career. We have a lot of resources for very many different situations that come up in our fair play world. And also we have lots of facilitators and therapists who understand these issues and are willing to work with couples. So we're really it's a nonprofit now, and we're really trying to make these resources accessible to everybody. So come to our website. And of course, you can follow us at Fair Play Life is our Instagram handle.
Well, wonderful. We've reached the end of our show today. Thank you so much, Eve Rodsky, for joining us today to discuss how to divide household tasks fairly using Eve's Fair Play system and practical tools to communicate your needs and priorities to your partner effectively, and really how fair play has redefined partnership. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Heather, for having me.
Oh, it was great. And listeners, if you or someone you know is going through a divorce or is thinking about a divorce in the Northeast Florida area, please reach out to us at FloridaWomen'sLawGroup.com. You'll find our practice areas and the link to our website in the show notes, as well as Eve's links. Thank you for listening.